Right.
Congratulations, Melissa. It's great. I'm looking at the chat here.
Let's have a look. Oh, wonderful. Oh, that's great. Fantastic. Okay, well, I think we will get started. Massive collaborators, welcome to Jurgen Wolff, and thank you so much for joining us here tonight. So Jurgen, your role sheet is huge. You're a screenwriter, you're a writing coach, you've written 9 books, which is an outstanding number of books. And I understand hundreds of episodes for TV as well, and films like The Real Harold Spitz and Midnight Man. We are really delighted to have you here today, Jurgen. Can you tell us a bit about how you got into the creative world? And, you know, obviously there's so much that you could talk about, but just some highlights from your illustrious career to date.
Well, I think it started with The Twilight Zone, which was when I was a kid growing up, the original Twilight Zone with Rod Serling doing the introductions, and he wrote a lot of the episodes. I loved that show, and that's kind of, I was a big reader anyway also, but I think on the media side, that Twilight Zone was my inspiration. And when I was about 12 or 13, I saw a notice in the newspaper that Mr. Serling was in the hospital, unfortunately, and it mentioned Cedars-Sinai, Los Angeles Hospital. So I wrote to him, care of Cedars-Sinai, and I said, Mr. Serling, I'm a huge fan of yours, blah, blah, blah. I hope you get well soon. I hope to be a writer someday. And lo and behold, he answered me a handwritten note saying, thank you so much. This means a lot to me, and all the best of luck. I'm sure you will be a writer, something like that. Many years later, I lost the note in a fire. Unfortunately, my whole house burned down. It's a whole nother story. But that was, you know, just a wonderful moment, because I never expected to hear from him. So that kind of encouragement was great. I did have a little sort of diversion first of working in the field of educational research and development and developing educational materials. But eventually I thought, I don't want to spend the rest of my life doing that. There's nothing wrong with it, but it wasn't what I really wanted to do. So I moved down to LA. I had no contacts. I had nobody down there that I knew at all, and just put everything into my car and drove down, and had about a year's worth of savings if I lived on peanut butter, which is what I did. Peanut butter sandwiches was my primary diet for a year. And then I picked up a little bit of extra work from the Disney Corporation, but the educational side of it. And so I ended up having 2 years worth of peanut butter sandwich money. And it took 2 years to break in, but I just started writing spec scripts and, you know, approaching people, agents, getting lots of rejections, and eventually got an agent who would represent me. And I had a very good bit of advice that I also would pass on to people, which is that initially I wanted to write everything. I wanted to write TV, movies, feature films, sitcoms, etc. And so I wrote spec scripts in all these different genres or different fields. And somebody I got to know there said, you know, you're spreading yourself too thin. It's hard enough to break into one of these areas, much less 6 of them at the, you know, at the same time. He said, pick one and focus on that until you get some credibility as a writer. Then you can always spread out later. And so I chose sitcoms. This was a time when Golden Girls and Benson and Family Ties and shows like that were, you know, #1 in the ratings. Sitcoms, it was one of those golden age periods. And eventually I got, I wrote 9 spec scripts, and I got an agent who said, well, I'll try sending them out. I'm not going to sign you, but we'll see what happens. So he fortunately was able to get me in a meeting with a show, and I started writing sitcoms. And for a while, quite a while, that was the main thing that I wrote. Benson was one of them, Family Ties was one of them, Love Boat, a few others. And that was the start. And eventually I was able to spread out and start writing some other things, TV, movies, and drama, as well as comedy and so on. But I think when you're getting started, it is a good idea to pick one genre And if, let's say you've got a spec script that's a thriller and you send it to a company or you get an agent to send it in to a company and they say, well, we like your writing. We're not going to buy this script because, and it might be the budget's too big or we're doing something similar or whatever. What else do you have? But if they like your thriller writing, what they want to hear is probably another thriller idea, not a romantic comedy or something far removed from that. So, it's worthwhile deciding which genre you want to focus on and sticking with that. Eventually, I after my house burned down, actually, which was in Hollywood Hills, I had been coming to England just to see theater and to enjoy England every year. And when the house burned down, it was one of those turning points. I thought, I really like living in London. I'm going to move and see what happens, see if I can continue to make a living as a writer. And for quite a few years, I was traveling back and forth between London and Los Angeles. But then I also found an opportunity to work in Germany and German TV. That was really spreading out at the time. And I don't write in German, but I speak and understand German. So that was a benefit. I've had done some stuff here as well. And I managed to keep it going. I didn't make and don't make as much money as I did in LA, but the quality of life is much better. And that's an important trade-off. So yeah, that's the semi-short version.
Wow. And when did you actually start writing the books as well, Jurgen? Was that kind of early on or was that quite a way into your career?
No, it was fairly well. What I did was I didn't have any contacts, as I said. And so I was thinking I'd love to talk to agents. I'd love to talk to producers and find out how things really work here. And, but of course I can't just knock on people's doors saying, hello, I'm, the 100th new writer who arrived today in Hollywood hoping to make it. Will you spend an hour or two of your time with me? So I thought, who do they talk to? They talk to journalists. And I'd done a little bit of journalism. And so I started a newsletter called The Hollywood Scriptwriter. And my first interview was with a writing teacher of mine, Danny Simon, who was Neil Simon's brother. And he did it because most people are interested in talking to Neil Simon, not to him. So this was a big plus for me that I wanted to talk to him. And he was quite well known in the TV writing business. And then the next interview, the next month, was with one of the guest speakers from Danny's class. And those two gave it a kind of credibility. So I was able to get in eventually to talk to lots of writers and producers and agents and directors and so on. And I kept putting this out and it was subscription kind of thing. And so I made a little bit of money from it, but more importantly, I learned a lot of things that I wanted to find out and made a few contacts. And eventually there was a lot of material there. So I thought, well, this would be good in a book to put this all together into a book. So that was one of the first books called Successful Scriptwriting. And it was picked up by Writer's Digest publishing company. And then I eventually, having done a lot of sitcoms, I wrote one about sitcom writing. So the educational background that I'd had in educational materials was helpful for that.
Fantastic. And I've read a couple of your books, Jurgen, and I've taken one of your courses at Raindance. So I am a big fan of yours. Some of the questions that I'm going to ask you tonight are about probably my favorite writing book in the world, and that is Your Writing Coach. I literally have it as my right-hand book. And I also, as I was preparing for tonight, saw that somebody had said there's only 2 books on writing that they recommend, Stephen King's and yours. And I have to say that I would really agree with that because it's wonderful. It's so succinct, it's very practical, and it is full of so many exercises and practical things, which I think as creatives we really need. So I absolutely love it, and I would recommend it to everybody here tonight. One of the things that you mention in the book is about fear being something that holds us back as writers. And you go into, the different types of fear, like the fear of rejection, the fear of not being good enough. What's your advice on how we can overcome those sorts of fears?
Well, the first thing is the fear of rejection and even the fear of not being good enough. Those are not irrational. Most of us have to write for a while before we get good enough, but even then, rejection is part of the deal. If you want to be a writer, screenwriter, any kind of writer, probably, rejection is just part of the deal, and you have to get used to dealing with it. However, one strategy that I recommend if you're starting out particularly and very nervous about what you're writing is to make it safe for yourself. So for example, you might say, I'm going to commit to finishing this screenplay or this novel, whatever you're writing, but I reserve the right not to show it to anybody. If I decide at the end I'm not going to show it, that's fine. So I go into it knowing that safety is there. Once you've finished it, you can say, okay, I finished it. Well, am I willing to show it to one person, somebody that I know, whose judgment I trust, who is constructive but honest, and see what they think about it. And if I want to, that's the only person I'll ever show it to. So again, you feel kind of safe with that. And probably they will give you some good constructive advice, and you may want to rework certain things. And then you can decide, do I want to show it to more people? So at each step of the way, there's a safety that kind of helps reassure you that you're never going to be in a position of having it out there and people are not, laughing at it or whatever, sort of irrational ideas we have about what might happen. And that kind of makes the process more secure and easy for you. The other thing I would recommend is when you finish something, you may want to take a little break, but don't take too long a break. Get started on the next thing so that your focus is on that rather than if you at the same time you're sending out, let's say, your script to people. If nothing else is going on, then it's so easy to get obsessed with, oh, they haven't answered yet. That must mean they hate it, and so on. In fact, they're probably just busy and behind. It takes ages sometimes to get responses from anybody. But if your focus is on creating the next thing, then that helps you deal with some of the insecurity about the last thing.
It's really good advice. It's brilliant. Quite a few of our members at Collab Writers, they juggle lots of different things. So, they have sort of portfolio creative careers, but many as well do have full-time jobs and quite full-on full-time jobs. I know it's something that, again, you mentioned in your writing coach, is how you can actually capitalize on, having another career or doing something else. Have you got any tips about how you can use what you do in the other part of your life in your creative writing?
Yes, I mean, sometimes writers that are past their 20s, let's say, think, oh, I don't know, is this a disadvantage and so on. Actually, creatively, it's often an advantage to have had more experience, to have traveled more and have perhaps had a variety of jobs, etc. So there's that external experience that is very helpful. You can certainly apply it in terms of settings, places you've lived, jobs you've had, etc. Specific external experiences that give you an insight into situations, settings, and so on that other people might not have. And so if you write, let's say using a setting that you're familiar with, that's going to give your script or your novel a sense of authenticity that others would have to work very hard to get through research. So certainly in that way, look at how you can capitalize on that. But even more important, I think, is your internal experience, meaning what are the things you've experienced emotionally. By a certain age, you probably had your heart broken at least once, maybe more than once. You've dealt with loss. You know what grief is. You may have lost a job and had to deal with your identity, perhaps being unsettled because you defined yourself in terms of a certain job. I mean, there's all kinds of life experiences, and for better or worse, the older we get, the more of those we have. There's some are good, some are not so pleasant, but all of them are useful in the writing trade to call upon. And so even if the character is very different from you in some ways, you have a situation where they experience a loss, then you have that experience yourself to call upon and to integrate. So I think having life experience is a great benefit for a writer. Now, if you don't have, let's say you want to write about Paris, your script is set in Paris, for example, and you haven't been, or you've only been for a day or two, there's an amazing world of help available to us now that wasn't available when I was starting out in the form of the internet. And I don't mean necessarily the Wikipedia, et cetera, that's great too, but I'm just talking about the probably millions of people who have blogs, podcasts, et cetera, and often talk about very specific things. I don't know how many nurses have blogs, for example, and specific nurses with particular specialties or doctors or whatever. And most of these people will be very happy to help you if you approach them. You know, you research, find the blogs that are about that particular kind of job or a person who has that job, and you approach them and say, I'm writing a novel or a script set in the emergency department of a small hospital or whatever it might be. Most of them would be delighted to help you with fact checking, even giving you ideas about the daily life of a person like that, et cetera. And of course, you can thank them. And if you're writing a book, you can put it into the acknowledgements, et cetera. But most of them are happy to do that, not for money, but because they enjoy sharing what they know, which is why they have a blog or podcast in the first place. So do avail yourself of that source of research. It's wonderful.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's, I suppose, in a world where we are so connected, I think sometimes, we just do a search, whereas we forget to actually contact individuals sometimes. So that's really good advice. I'm conscious also that a lot of people are not quite sure whether what they're writing is, the thing that they should be writing. And I know that in your writing coach, you talk about the magic why, asking yourself and again and again why you're actually writing something. Can you talk us through how that works and why it works, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, why is it necessary too? It's because writing a script or a novel is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It takes time, it takes dedication. You've got to be sure, as sure as you can be at least at the start, that this is the one to work on. Because if you don't, then you're going to probably end up with a lot of half-finished projects going into the drawer. And because you lose the momentum halfway through or you question it halfway through. So it's very helpful to say, why is this the one? Most of us have more ideas than we have time to write scripts or novels based on those ideas. So why this one? And so initially it might be something quite surfacey. I'll give you an personal example. I've finished a script recently, just gone to my agent, called The Hoarder. And it's a horror story, but with some differences from a typical horror story. But why did I want to write that? Well, the superficial aspect was that there's a show that I've seen a few times on television. I don't know if it's still on, but there was a show called Hoarders. And it's reality TV, it's real people. And of course, the worst cases of hoarding it's a mental illness, really, that people cannot let go of anything, including trash, including, wrappers, everything. And their houses are like incredible labyrinth with stuff piled to the ceiling, and often their hoarding is triggered by some sort of trauma. But then there's some people that are a little bit more borderline collectors. It's like collecting gone out of control. And why did that interest me? Well, one reason was I've thought before about our society, our disposable society. When I was a little kid, lived in Toronto for a couple of years, and we were quite poor at the time. So we lived in this immigrants neighborhood, and there was always a little corner shop somewhere, some guy, often an antisocial type of guy, who had a little tiny place where you could take in your stuff to be fixed. So if you had a toaster that stopped working, you didn't throw it away the way you do today. You take it and he would charge you $2 to fix it, or your Hoover or whatever it was. And nowadays we don't even think about that. In fact, most of these things you can't fix because they're, the way they're sealed and so on. So you just chuck it out. And that sort of led to me thinking about disposable people. Like there's certain people in society that many people think of as disposable. Homeless people, people who are different in lots of different ways, often are treated that way. So that interested me as a theme. And I thought it'd be interesting to tell the story of a hoarder who has the idea that he is kind of almost like a museum keeper, in that he's got Betamax machines and so on. So he doesn't save wrappers or pizza crust or whatever, but he's got all these devices from way back. And then the horror angle came. I thought, what if this place that he lives in is a portal where the souls or ghosts, what you want to call it, of people who've been discarded come back and get revenge on the people that discarded them. So there was a guy who was the victim of a hit and run driver who abandoned him, could have saved him, just drove away. There's a man, a blind man who had a carer who cheated him, took all of his money, left him to starve to death, and so on. So that put it into the genre of horror. And maybe there's a personal, I mean, we're getting into therapy here, which I don't want to particularly do, but I think having moved from Germany as a 5-year-old to Toronto, Canada, a totally new language, totally new culture. I don't know if I felt disposable, but I certainly felt like an outsider. And so maybe it goes all the way back to that. But so I wanted to tell the story ultimately of somebody who's still alive, who has, it's a young woman who was injured and scarred badly in a fire. And she considers herself disposable because she's so self-conscious about these scars. And I want to tell the story of how through this adventure that she goes on in this house, she stops defining herself as disposable and finds the courage to be who she is, regardless of whether some people might laugh at her or think she's a freak or whatever. So I just thought it'd been easier to demonstrate that than to try to explain it. So whatever ideas you're working with, think about, why do I want to tell it? What aspect of it? And dig as deep as you can. And if you find that the last why that you get to really resonates with you, then that's probably the right project for you to do.
That's fascinating. And yeah, that script sounds amazing. I mean, do you have any idea when that might come out? I mean, I guess it's kind of in its very early stages, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I haven't even had a response from my agent yet. So I'm who knows? These are all, I'm already working on the next thing, as I advised, so that I don't obsess over what's happening with this one.
That sounds fascinating. And I know that, I mean, just from you talking about that, obviously, generating ideas, you have so much experience that I guess that comes to you quite naturally. But for people who are starting off, or for those who struggle with generating ideas, have you got any sort of suggestions on how one can do that? Because I know in your writing coach and in your courses as well, you do go into sort of group exercises doing that kind of thing. Can you share any of that with us?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things. In fact, I did a book called Creativity Now, which includes like 25 idea generating methods and how to get into the right frame of mind for generating ideas and so on. And it didn't necessarily come naturally to me, although I think all of us who are writers probably have lots of ideas. But when I first went to Hollywood, as I mentioned, I decided to start writing, try to write sitcoms. So I wrote these spec scripts. And then what I discovered was, once my agent could get me into shows to pitch ideas, they expected me to come in with 6 to 8 specific storylines for their show. And the best storylines are not translatable to just another show. In other words, the more specific your idea is to the show you're pitching to, the better, the more it fits those characters in that situation. And I realized very quickly that just sitting around and thinking what might happen, hoping for inspiration to strike, doesn't work very well. And it's nerve-wracking. And so I started doing some research, thinking who is good at, who has to think of lots of ideas, or what field might be useful. And there were 2 fields. One was advertising, because advertising people have to come up with loads of ideas for the campaigns that they do. And the other was psychology. What about the psychology of creativity and of idea generation? And so that's where I found a lot of these methods, some of which I adapted from industry to writing. But one of my favorites is juxtaposition, meaning that you join a random word with whatever the problem is, or the question you have, or the situation. And so what I do, let me see if I make up little lists here. Whoops. there, of words. I got a whole bunch of these. And the way that I do it, just to make it easy to generate them, is one word per letter of the alphabet. So this one is apple, bonus, cracker, demolish, eagle, film, garbage, my handwriting's a little tough to read here, hula hoop, ill, jackass, and so on, right? And I have a bunch of these, so I just pick one at random. So if we've got, let's say we're trying to think of, let's say you're writing a romantic comedy and you want the guy to propose and you want to come up with a fresh, interesting manner in which he proposes, either a setting or something he does different to get away from the typical, down on one knee at a romantic spot kind of thing. So then I would look at this and generate ideas. I'll give an example in a minute, but one of the rules of brainstorming is quantity. Try to come up with as many ideas as you can, and no judging. That's the important part. Do not judge at the same time you're trying to generate, because if you do, you will stop yourself, dead. That critic could come in later. Once you've generated a whole bunch of them, then you can look at them and see which one of these might actually work. So we've got eagle, for example. What if he has, how falcons can carry stuff and then they land on somebody's arm? Maybe he has a ring that he has this bird and it's supposed to land on his arm. Of course, it's a comedy, it'll land somewhere else or it'll bite him or I don't know what. But another one is hula hoop. So maybe he engages a troupe of dancers or cheerleaders, maybe, to spell out his proposal. And again, if it's a comedy, they'll mix up the letters, and if, depending on whether you want drama, comedy, etc. Lounge is another one. What if they've got a favorite restaurant, and there's live music, and maybe in that lounge music, he wants the guy to sing the proposal, like if Frank Sinatra would be, to sing the proposal to her. And again, if it's a comedy, something will go terribly wrong. The guy will be drunk or whatever. He'll mix up the names. Another couple will be there. And the woman in that couple will think her boyfriend's proposing and he isn't. I don't know, this is just stuff off the top of my head, but you get the idea. By making that random association, lots of ideas come up. And most of them will not be good. And that's fine, because most of them don't have to be good. If you generate 40 or 50 of these, and one of them is good or two of them are good, that's all you need. You just need one. So when I was trying to come up with sitcom ideas, I would try to come up with like 50 or so. I think, who are the characters? What's the situation? One example I use quite a lot in the class is Golden Girls, because most people have seen it, even though it's an old show. But a lot of people have seen it in reruns and they kind of know the characters who are very well defined. So Dorothy in that it's 4 women, if you haven't seen it, 4 older women living together. And there were very specific personalities. Dorothy was a teacher, very straight ahead kind of lady. And then Blanche was this Southern belle who was very vain and interested in men to a fault, and so on. And so I would think, okay, Blanche, she's the Southern belle who's always looking for younger men. And what's one of my words here is, what was apple? Okay, so what would that lead to? Does she meet a guy at the fruit market, at a fruit stand? Just write down whatever idea popped in and try to generate 40 or 50 of those, and then winnow it down. And most of the time, there were only half a dozen that were worth maybe pursuing further. But that was using quantity to eventually get to some quality. So that's my favorite one. One other one that I like a lot is the opposite technique, which is looking at what usually happens. So for example, if you're plotting a story, you of course would like to avoid having it be predictable. So you might want to generate some ideas. What's the opposite of what usually happens in this kind of a story? So if it's a kidnapping story, usually somebody's kidnapped, let's say a child is kidnapped, and then the bad people want to have ransom. So what's the opposite of that? The opposite of that would be somebody depositing somebody on your doorstep, and maybe you want money for that, or the opposite of them wanting a ransom would be paying you to give the person back. And there was a movie like that with Danny DeVito and Bette Midler, I think, where Bette Midler, I think she fakes the kidnapping and he doesn't want her back, so he refuses to pay, something like that. I can't remember, years ago. But there was a story some of you may know from O. Henry, the short story writer, called The Ransom of Red Chief, like that, where they kidnapped this obnoxious little boy, these two guys, and the relatives are so happy to get rid of this kid that they refuse to take him back. And in the end, I think the two guys have to pay the relatives to take the child back. But anyway, the point is simply try to look at what's the opposite. And usually the direct opposite will not be workable, but some variation of it might be.
Yeah, I mean, I remember from your class actually just thinking that it was kind of turning, these things were sort of turning my brain around a bit. And I just found it made me come up with so many more ideas than I would have done otherwise. And I think the tendency sometimes is that we get an idea and we just go with it when it's really not necessarily the right idea. So I guess, you know, I really do agree that the sort of quantity thing is excellent as well, just to sort of, I guess, give you as much opportunity as you can.
There was one study that was done for people coming up with invention ideas, I think it was, and they discovered that the first few ideas that you come up with are quite predictable. They're things that have been done. They're the obvious ones. And then if you push past that, you tend to go into really outrageous ones that probably won't work. And only then, in that sort of third phase, do you tend to think of ideas that are original and workable. So it's well worth pushing further, even though you think, hey, this works. And often we are so relieved when we think of something that works that we want to stop and just do it. But just take the time to push past it. And you can always go back to that one if you don't think of anything better. But if you keep going, you may well think of something better.
Yeah. It's just to pick up a couple of things in the chat. So somebody asked earlier, when do you decide to sort of go with an idea? And then this other question now from Chris is, how do you tell a good idea from a bad one?
Well, I think, you know, as I said, if you've got several ideas, then do that sort of why test and see which one seems to be the one you care about the most, you're most passionate about. I can guarantee when you're halfway through it, you'll probably question yourself and say, oh, I was wrong. The other one was better. But you should really commit to finishing that one. One of the people I met through the interviews that I did for that newsletter that I mentioned was Stephen Cannell, who was the most prolific writer, producer of television in those days. He did the Rockford Files, the A-Team, 10 Speed and Brown Shoe, and various others. Really nice chap. I interviewed him twice actually. And even though he was an incredibly successful producer, he considered himself a writer first and foremost. And I asked him, what was the best advice that you had, or the thing that you changed about how you worked? And he said, well, I always used to get excited about something. I'd start writing it. And then halfway through, I'd think, oh, I don't know, it's tough and it isn't as good as I thought it was going to be. And oh, I had this other idea. And then he said, I'd go back to that one. And pretty soon I had a whole drawer full of half-finished ideas. And he said, I decided finally that whatever I committed to next, I would finish it. And if it was, and excuse my language or his language, but he said, if it was a bag of shit, at least it would be a 3-act finished bag of shit. And he said, that makes me think more carefully about what I commit to, but I continue to do that. I will finish it. And if it still seems like I made the wrong choice, well, that's how it is. But I think you just have to make a decision at one point or another and say, this is it, and I'm going to commit to it. And when that doubt appears, usually in the middle of the second act, if you're writing a screenplay, just ignore it. Do not go for that shiny new idea, because it's going to end up in exactly the same place where you are right now. So go ahead and finish that. And what was the other question?
Yes, how to tell a good idea from a bad one.
Well, I think part of it you have to have an instinct for. And every idea will, at various times as you're writing it, seem great and at other times terrible. So you have to almost step back from that and say, I'm going to, as I say, going to complete it. Now, before you commit to it, I do think you have to believe in projects that you do. I don't believe in chasing trends or trying to outguess the marketplace. That never works. But it can be useful to think about what is going on at the moment. So one of the reasons that I committed to writing The Hoarder was, even though I'd had the idea previously, it was one of a bunch of ideas that I had sort of in the background. And when I came to decide what's the next one going to be, we were in the early stages of lockdown, and film companies were not able to make films. And so what they call a contained script, that is a script where the action takes place in primarily one location, is very helpful to them. It's also great for low budget films because for obvious reasons. And most of this story takes place in the hoarder's house. And therefore, at least from a setting standpoint, it's contained. And also the cast is fairly small. It's the hoarder, the victims, the people that were discarded, and the people who discarded them. And so it's not a huge cast. So I thought this is a good one to do next, partly because I felt really committed to it and passionate about the idea, but also because it fit the needs of the marketplace. And even though we're coming out of the lockdown, I think it's still a pretty good time for scripts like that. I hope so.
Yeah.
So you can take that kind of thing into consideration.
Yeah. And it's also, obviously we're talking more as a world about mental health as well. So it's also important, I think, to for that sort of reason as well.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of torture porn horror, where it's just how many people can we gruesomely decapitate or whatever. Even though my script does have some graphic scenes in it, the theme is really more, what interested me much more was the character arc of this young woman with the scarring and so on, and how she changes. So I feel like it's a horror film, and if you're going because you like moments of terror, then great. But if you want to see a film that has some more aspects to it, then it has that as well.
Yeah. So talking of characters, it sounds like your character in the Hoarder is an interesting character. I know that in your writing coach, you mentioned Dickens's Miss Havisham, and it was lovely to sort of reread those paragraphs of how Dickens created that wonderful character. Do you believe that there are any sort of secrets or any secrets that you can share to creating powerful characters, or is it just something that one has to work at, do you think?
Well, both. You have to work at it, but I think if you think about who are the memorable characters from your life, in the class we do an exercise on that, on remembering somebody memorable from your past history. Often it's a teacher comes to mind, or a grandparent, or whatever. And we talk about what makes them memorable. Often it's maybe partly their appearance, the way they spoke, their attitude, their kindness, or lack thereof. And so it's looking for things that stand out, that are specific within the universal. So if it's a boxer, let's say, what makes that person different from other boxers? And one thing to avoid is going to the opposite. I mention this usually, that there's a stereotype. Let's say the boxers is not too bright guy, just good with his fists and not interested in anything else. And so sometimes the temptation is to say, mine will be a Harvard graduate who writes poetry sensitively in his spare time. Or my grandmother will be riding a Harley Davidson, and and that becomes a stereotype in itself, the opposite. So something more nuanced than that is useful. You can base, of course, characters as an amalgam of people that you've known, and even characters that you've seen or read about. In fact, mentioning Miss Havisham, in The Hoarder, there is a bride, an older woman who was jilted at the altar, and she shows up in her wedding dress as a spirit or a ghost, and has more than a passing resemblance to Miss Havisham, because I love that character in that book. So yeah, it's finding what makes those people stand out and what makes them memorable. And usually it means kind of a photo fit of putting together different elements from different sources. The hoarder that I have is, even though he's not the primary character, it's the protagonist is a young woman, but the hoarder is an important character. And he's a very genial, I mean, I took a little bit from Hannibal Lecter, but he's not creepy like that. He is genial. He is very intelligent. He knows his history very well. This goes in line with the idea of, saving things in a museum like. And one of the things that, for example, that comes up is he's got old radio sets, and he turns one of them on, and it happens to have a broadcast from back in just before the Second World War, when there was a ship full of Jewish people trying to land to get away from Germany, and America and other countries turned them away, and they had to go back to Germany, where a lot of them died in concentration camps. So it was a little side thing where it's showing why he's saving these things, these stories, and these artifacts. And so he's, again, I find him quite an interesting character. He's not just the sadistic kind of guy who enjoys seeing people mangled or whatever.
And that sort of chimes in with one of the questions that's come through on the chat, which is, so Beatrice has said, being born in Germany, do you feel European or North American? And does that reflect in your writing? If so, how? I mean, I think you're suggesting that it does come through in some way, perhaps.
Yes, one of the interesting things was that I realized after a long time is there's a theme that comes through in quite a few of my scripts without me intending. I mean, I don't set out to say this script will be about this, but the theme is starting over, and in many different permutations. And I guess even in The Hoarder, the young woman by the end is starting over as someone who no longer demeans herself or accepts other people's opinions of her. And I think that's because I said I was 5 when we left Germany, moved to to Canada rather, first for 2 years. Then we moved to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, which was another starting over. And then when I wanted to break into TV and film, I moved to LA, which was, again, not as big of a geographical or cultural thing, but certainly, as I said, I didn't know anybody. It was totally starting over in that way. And then eventually I moved to London, and that was a starting over. So I've done that a lot, and I guess it creeps into my writing without me necessarily thinking about it. And I think that will happen for most of you. Once you've written a bunch of stuff, if you step back, you may find certain themes emerging that you weren't even necessarily aware of. And that's a good thing, because that's your contribution. I always say the goal is to write what only you can write. And that's part of it. It will come out if you let it. And that'll make your work more appealing to the powers that be too. Going back to this question of as an somewhat older person, you have experience, etc. I taught at University of Southern California for a little while when I lived in LA. And there I was teaching undergraduates. And most of them were busily rewriting the most recent film they'd seen, dinosaurs, and it was all, and I had a really hard time pushing them to say, no, let's hear something that is different that you can contribute. And I know you're only 21 or whatever it was, but you've had things that happen in your life and feelings that you've had and so on. Let's see how you can apply those to telling a story. And it was harder work with that group than it is here. So.
And that sort of brings me on to a book of yours that I'm dying to read, but I haven't read yet, which is Do Something Different, that's about creatives who have stood out by doing something different. Can you give us a couple of examples, or one example of something that is different, that has come to your attention?
Yeah, it's not just writers, it's also entrepreneurs of various kinds. This was one of the early books I did. I was just fascinated by the notion of how do you stand out? How do you, succeed in a very crowded marketplace, which is true in not just in show business, but in lots of businesses. And I've been collecting examples of that. So I wrote them up, and it was published by Virgin Business Books, and did fairly well, actually, as kind of as a business book. But one of the key messages, basically, you need to stand out. Your script needs to stand out. You need to stand out because it is a crowded marketplace. And so how can it stand out? What can you do that is different? There was somebody, this is in the area of novels, but somebody who wrote the first novel that exists entirely in the form of tweets. And in fact, they tweeted it out, and it got tremendous, I don't know if it's any good, but it got a lot of attention and was published because it was different. There was another example, let's see. Somebody that actually, they made a film. It was a writer-director who made a film and claimed that it cost $12 to make. He used his grandmother's Super 8 camera and had all these stories about how he did it without any money. Now, I doubt that it really just cost $12, but the media are interested in the biggest, the smallest, the newest, the oldest, and that's how he got attention for the film that he wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So maybe he fibbed a little. I don't think it was, a terrible thing to do by representing it that way. Certainly, if you have something in your background that particularly qualifies you to write the story that you're writing, that's something to highlight in your query letter that you send to producers or agents or whatever. Especially if any of these things actually happen to you, there's always a little leeway. We used to say when I was writing TV movies that if it said based on a true story, then some of the story was real. If it was inspired by a true story, it was totally made up. But they stuck that inspired by a true story on because it seemed to be a selling point. So it can be, the thing that stands out can be the subject of your film. It can be the format of a film. It can be your relationship to the film. So somebody that, again, when it's a true story or mostly a true story, that often gets media attention. And people who buy scripts are already thinking ahead to marketing. So they're thinking, if I make this film, how am I going to sell it? What's going to make it stand out as a film? And so you need to be thinking about that as well as much as possible ahead, not to tell them about that, they'll figure it out, but to give them something to work with, basically.
Yeah, that's very good advice, and especially I think given so many people, these days do have something else that they can sort of draw on from their experience. Something that it's very sort of fresh in my memory still, even though I did your course, I'm sure it was about 10 years ago. I've lost track of time, but and something you talk about in your book, Focus, which is also excellent, is the whole sort of concept of massive action, about sort of, you were talking earlier about, the need to sort of finish what you're doing. Can you just talk us through what a mad day is and why we should do them?
Yeah, I haven't done any for a while, but I used to do this crazy thing I called Massive Action Day, where I would be online for 24 hours. It was pre-Zoom too. It was a little harder to do it in those days. But I would be online for 24 hours. And I would invite people to join in, to declare a goal, and to commit to a certain number of hours. Now, there were a couple of crazy people who were with me the entire 24 hours, but most people weren't. Most people said, okay, today for 6 hours, I'm going to be with you. I'm not going to do anything else. And they would declare the goal online, and then they would work for a couple of hours. And then we would all get together and share notes, or, somebody might have a question, say, oh, I'm working on this thing, and I've got a scene where this and this, anybody have an idea what I can do about that? So we would brainstorm for a few minutes, everybody get up, drink some water, etc., and then go back to work. And it meant that there was a focused period where you had kind of moral support from everybody doing it. We were doing it together. It was a joint effort in a way, even though we also individually, of course, were working on our own projects. We weren't collaborating on one project, but it still felt like there was some kind of support and unity, which a lot of people don't have. There are lots of people who privately, said to me, well, my husband doesn't really take me seriously when I write, and so on. So they needed to find that. And unfortunately, it was mostly women who had husbands or boyfriends who were like, oh, it's nice that you do this little thing of writing, being patronizing. So they needed to have a situation where people were not patronizing, where we're all in the same boat, we all want to achieve something creative. And so I would keep that going for 24 hours. Now that's an extreme version, but you can do this for yourself to say, schedule it. And if you need to get away from your normal location, which you may, if you've got people surrounding who don't quite understand what you're doing or don't understand the concept of do not disturb while I'm writing, a lot of people say, well, you're only writing, So find a place, a library, a friend's house, wherever you can, and say for 6 hours or 4 hours or 8 hours, whatever it is, I'm going to just focus on this one thing, and then definitely take breaks and drink water and walk around a little bit, but that's all that you're going to focus on. And you can get an enormous amount done in that time period and really gain some momentum. Sometimes people who work on projects in their spare time find it's really hard to get momentum going. It's like I've got 30 minutes here and 20 minutes here, and I just don't feel like I'm making any progress or enough progress. So giving it a focused period of time like that can make a huge difference. And you can do that once a month or whatever works for you.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant advice, Jurgen. And do you yourself, do you have a daily practice that you have to keep momentum? How do you do it yourself?
It depends. When I'm working on an assignment where there's a deadline, definitely. And usually I think in terms of pages per day, not hours or time, because that can be very misleading. That started a long time ago that I stopped saying I'm going to work on my writing for 2 hours, because I'd have a copy of Variety there and I'd say, oh, this story is kind of relevant. I think I'll read this story. And then, now with the internet, the temptation's even worse.
Yeah.
So I found that setting a page goal per day worked much better. And you can adjust that to however much time you have available. So when I'm writing on an assignment, I do work every day and usually have a goal. Depends on the nature of the project and how well I've outlined it already, et cetera. It might be 4 pages a day, 5 pages a day, something like that. If I'm just working on spec stuff, I allow myself a little more leeway and a little more time off if I feel like taking it, especially like here in England when the sun is shining, you better get out there because tomorrow it won't be shining. So I allow myself to have some days off like that. But it's a good idea to have a practice, obviously, if you can.
Yeah, definitely. And as we are Collab writers, I'm very conscious that you have co-written a couple of books as well. What in your view, is the sort of essence of a good collaboration or a collaboration that works?
Well, the biggest mistake that I've seen in collaborations that didn't work is finding someone that thinks a lot like you, which is what we look for in friends, right? It's nice to be on the same page politically, socially, etc., with our friends. Sometimes it's invigorating to befriend someone who isn't on the same wavelength, but generally we look for people that are kind of like us. And what you don't want to do is to collaborate with someone who has exactly the same strengths as you do. So if you love writing dialogue and you're great with characters, but you're not so good on plot, then you got to look for somebody that loves plotting. They're harder to find, but still they are out there. So find somebody who has a skill set that is different from yours, and that when combined with yours creates a great, whole, a great unity. And that means sometimes you're dealing with people that have very different personality than you, etc. That's fine. I mean, obviously you don't want to get somebody you're going to fight with all the time, but still. So that's number one, is look for people who have skills that are complementary to yours, not identical to yours. The second thing I would recommend is have a trial marriage. Don't set out and don't commit when you're not sure yet how it's going to work out to work together, to writing a screenplay together. We're going to write a whole script together. Let's say a short film. Let's see how that goes. Let's write a short film together. And you'll see whether it works or not. If, despite what I said, if there's too much opposition in your personalities, then that's not going to work either. So how does the other person deal with your suggestions? How do you deal with their suggestions? Are they open? can you come to an agreement when you disagree about something? And if all that works pretty well, then you can go on to do a bigger project. But I think it's a lot better to just give it a little trial first and see how that goes. And the other thing I would say is have in writing all the possible permutations of what might happen. So what happens if halfway through the script, your partner quits or you quit? What happens to the stuff that's already been done as a joint part of the project? Try to anticipate as many things. And I know it's awkward if you're friends with the person you're collaborating with. It's sort of a prenup, and those must be awkward too. I don't know. I haven't had one, but it's for the best of everybody that you look at all the possibilities and you work out how they would be settled. And I would add one clause which says if we cannot come to an agreement, we agree to submit to arbitration by, and it could be a specific person, or it can be, there are actually arbitration services that you can call upon, but they cost money, so that there's always a way out, so that it's never going to be totally at loggerheads and the project dies. And if the arbitration goes against you, what you think is right, tough luck, that's you agreed or they agreed. So I think those are the crucial things about collaborations. And lots of writers collaborate, especially in the television side of things, and especially comedy. It's great to have somebody to bounce your ideas off of. A lot of it in sitcoms, of course, is dialogue back and forth. I didn't collaborate on any scripts. Partly, I don't want to split the money too. That's the other thing, you have to give half the money up. But I sort of like working on my own. I think a lot of us are kind of solitary individuals. And so to me, that's one of the benefits, but I can see, particularly in certain genres, that it would be helpful to have somebody to bounce ideas off of. So we do have, one thing I advise is having, and this is a great group, I'm sure, for that, finding people whose judgment you think is pretty good. And when you hear them critique other people's material, they seem to be constructive and so on. And then ask them whether they would like to form a little critique group. I have one, it's only 2 other people in it. And we meet once a week on Tuesday nights. They're in America, both of them in California. And so for them, it's 11 in the morning. For me, it's 7 p.m. here. And we discuss each other's material. Now, some weeks we don't have new stuff, but a lot of times we do. We read each other's material, we give each other feedback. And it's enormously helpful. So I would suggest that you try to, set that up for yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I mean, one thing that we used to do back in the days pre-pandemic was we would meet up as a group and we would play a version of the old Victorian parlor game Consequences, where we'd sort of, play together and people would sort of learn to trust one another and just sort of, writing something together that didn't matter if it went wrong, and it was just a good way to sort of just get used to one another. So those sorts of practices were quite useful as well.
I see another question. Comedy show that has great writing.
Yes.
I love Seinfeld. I love Curb Your Enthusiasm. That's a particular kind of comedy that I think is very good. Friends was well written. I never got to be a big fan of Friends for whatever reason. I don't know, but I know the writing was very good. Frasier was one of my favorites. Very witty, funny writing. Those are a few of the top ones for me.
Brilliant. Does anybody have a question for Jurgen at all? You can either stick your hand up or just unmute yourself and ask. Or you can put it in the chat if you'd prefer me to. Lucy.
Chris has one.
Hi there.
Okay.
Hi, Jurgen.
Hi.
Thank you so much for an amazing evening. Really content rich. I was just wondering what your view is about agents, whether it's essential to have an agent if you've got a script that you want to be showing to people. Are agents, by definition, going to be having better contacts and able to get you to see producers or production companies with greater weight, greater heft in the industry? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, some people think that the main job of an agent is to make deals for you, but in fact, that's not, they do that, but the most important aspect of having an agent is that they do know, or they should, who's looking for what. And so they know which things to submit you for, where to send your spec script, and so on. And so definitely, if you can get an agent, that is, wonderful. It makes a huge difference. However, getting an agent is a whole process in itself. And I've found in the United Kingdom, production companies are more open to approaches from writers than in the States. In the States, you just can't get anything. I mean, they will tell you, we are not allowed to take anything. We don't consider anything. Door is closed. You have to either come in through an agent or through the recommendation of somebody we already work with. And so here, there's still, I think, a bit more opportunity to approach a company directly. Now, sometimes they will say, this sounds like an interesting idea, but unfortunately, we only consider material through an agent, and that's Joe Bloggs of Blogs Films, right? So what you can then do is to contact an agent, email them through their website, and say, Joe Bloggs of Blogs Films has expressed an interest in reading my script, but can only do it legally through an agent. I wonder if you'd be willing to represent only this script enough, to submit it to him. I don't expect you to sign me on the basis of the script, etc. But I wonder whether that might be something you would consider. And sometimes that works because they're not risking very much. I mean, they'll probably want to look at it to make sure your script is in fact decent, and that it's not going to be embarrassingly bad and look bad on them. But if there's a genuine expression of interest, even if it's not, a ringing endorsement from Joe Bloggs, that might be enough, particularly for the agents that don't have so many of the top writers that they represent. The agents have to make money too, and the only way they make money is by taking roughly 15% of what you make. And so a lot of times they're looking for new clients that they think is going to earn them some money. So that's one approach you can use. Never be afraid to approach a company through email or I would say, and this is a little tip, through actual writing, a letter. I know it's not done much, but that's why you should do it. Again, do something different, stand out. Nothing weird. I mean, don't send them any ticking packages or anything, but even a letter that comes through the letterbox is amazing these days for most of them. And so I would do that. And think of ways to approach them. If you see them, go to events like Raindance has and others do, where people talk, agents discuss topics and producers and so on, and write them and say, I saw you at the Raindance, whatever it was, and I really appreciated what you said about blah, blah, blah. Be specific to show you were there and you heard it. I've just finished a script and do a log line. I wonder whether it would be okay to submit it to you for your consideration. And 9 times out of 10, they may say no, or you may not hear from them. Although, again, British people are much more polite. In America, the new no is no answer. You just don't hear back. So here that still does happen sometimes, but more often they might say no. But still, that's okay. You've made you've approached somebody and keep going.
Thank you so much. Amazing.
Thank you, Jurgen. I think, Chris, you had your hand up, did you, before? Yeah.
Yes. Hello, Jurgen, from a fellow German. I wondered, how did you decide you wanted to express yourself in screenplays rather than, say, a novel or short stories? A screenplay so much depends on somebody showing an interest of turning that into a TV show or a film. It's not in itself a literary work that others are very likely to read, whereas a novel or a short story may well be.
That is true, and it's too bad I didn't think about that at the time. That is one of the frustrations. People say it's a collaborative medium, which can be great because sometimes your material falls into the hands of a really talented director and producer, and they're totally devoted to making the story work. And then you come off as better than you were. In other words, it makes your stuff better, your script better. there's also a lot of times when the ego of the director makes them decide they want to change things, or the producer isn't as good as they might be in terms of dealing with the material and so on. So that is one of the drawbacks. The reason I went into it, I think, is just because I love movies. I was totally, even when I was working in the educational field, I had a desk in this office, and I had movie posters and TV posters and stuff up, and I just liked the medium. I loved going to movies and immersing myself in them. I did love novels too, so it could have gone that way. And if I had it to do over, I don't know. I might set out to be a novelist, although there the chances of success and supporting yourself are probably even less than they are in screenplays. The difference is nowadays you can publish your own stuff, and that doesn't mean it's going to sell or you can get do it. But I think if you really love movies, then you're drawn to them, and you have to put up with the drawbacks to it from a writing standpoint. But hearing somebody say your words, some wonderful actor, hearing them, or I've also written some plays, not as much for the theater, but some, and that's been thrilling to hear a good actor, not necessarily famous actors even, but just a really good actor bring it alive. And there's one play I wrote that was done in 3 different productions, and each of the actresses who played the leads had a whole different reading on it, and yet it still worked. And I thought that was fascinating, that how that can happen. So yeah, it comes with some drawbacks, but what doesn't,
Thank you, Jurgen. I just wanted to mention as well that we've actually got somebody on tonight, Eric Redman, who was in Midnight Man, I understand.
Is that right?
So blast from the past.
Wow.
Yes. Yes. Do you remember, were you in Luxembourg as well at the time, Jurgen?
No.
You didn't take part in the location work at all?
No.
Oh, that's a shame. It was a lovely shoot, very enjoyable. I was playing Ilya, the Russian hoodlum.
Of course. Wow. Yes. I didn't.
I had lots of scenes with Hannes Jennecke. He was a big German star at the time. And you wrote in a very kind of cruel but funny scene. We had to do target practice. So me and Hannes, we had to shoot little teddy bears.
Teddy bears, yes.
Which my girlfriend at the time was thinking it was utterly reprehensible. So luckily Channel 5 showed the film after 9 o'clock, so it was all right.
Yeah. Oh wow, what a coincidence! That is amazing. Yes. No, I enjoyed working on that. And a friend of mine wrote the other sort of corresponding one. The name of which escapes me. There's another mini series.
There were 2.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
But
it was a lovely, enjoyable, really. And one of my favorite actors, Michael Sarrazin, was in it.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it was one of his latest works. I don't think I've seen him in much after that.
He was somebody that I always thought was a terrific actor, and it's one of those things where you never quite know why he didn't continue, but yeah, he was very good.
Yeah, I think he had his heyday in his 60s and the 70s in the States. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Oh, well, that's amazing.
What a small world.
Yes.
Well, Jurgen, thank you so much for your time tonight. I feel as if, we've all learned so much from you. And I am going to give another plug simply because for Jurgen's course, which is coming up at Rain Dance, I think later this month, it was absolutely brilliant. It really sort of got me going and got me committed and focused into a writing practice. And I'm very grateful to you, Jurgen, for giving me that sort of step up at a time when I really needed it as well. So
that's wonderful to hear, because when you write books, you never quite know, are they landing, are they doing? And I do get emails from time to time. So that's great. Yeah, this course, just very briefly, it's an advanced course. So this is for people who already know what the 3-act structure is, what the hero's journey is, what a character arc is. But I'm able to go in these 4 sessions that we're having starting on the 21st of this month into kind of a deeper dive into structure. Well, character is the first one, structure. The third one is writing treatments, which is a horrible format that everybody hates, but we have to learn how to write them. So I thought I'd go into that. And then marketing yourself and looking at some new ways to market your work, including using some aspect of social media like TikTok and others that you can take advantage of to get some attention for yourself or to do proof of concept for what you're writing, etc. So I think it's going to be really interesting. to work on that at a deeper level with you. So if you can and you're interested, as usual with Raindance, you can book one of those separately or two, or take the whole thing. I recommend taking the whole thing just because I try to kind of make it progressive in some ways, but it isn't essential. You'll still get lots out of it if you just do one of them or two of them. If anybody has any questions after tonight, I know sometimes it's like, oh, I wish I'd asked to ask this question or whatever. Feel free to email me. It's very simple, jurgenwolff@gmail.com. And the other thing I was going to say was there's a website that goes with the book, and it's been hacked, and I've been trying to get it, and Elliot will relate to this with the hacking recently of Raindance, but I had it fixed, and within 2 weeks it was hacked again. And so it's still down at the moment. I am working on it. So because there is further material for each chapter in the Your Writing Coach book. So try again. If you hit it, if you try it and it says down or whatever, try it again in a couple of weeks. Hopefully it will be up again. So.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for being so generous with your time as well. And if anybody does need a good book to read, I honestly can't recommend this more. It's so well thumbed and highlighted and underlined and all the rest of it. But it really is, genuinely 10 years on, just as good now as it was then. So thank you so much, Jurgen. And
it's been my pleasure. So good luck, everybody, with your writing, and hope to see you again sometime, maybe at the class or otherwise.
Feel free to unmute. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jurgen.
Thanks, Jurgen.
You're most welcome.
Thank you, Jurgen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
It's really
And
inspiring.
thanks, Jenny, for great questions.
Yes, thank you,
and
Jenny. That's
Well,
very
repeating
helpful
it
to
all.
have that structure.
Thank you. Thank you
Many
so much.
thanks.
I'm going to stay on if anybody wants to stay on for a bit. So very happy to chat.
Excellent.
Feel free to unmute yourselves and we can have a free-for-all. I'll stop.
Thanks again, Jenny. Really